Hello, everyone. This is Michael Justin Lee, the founder and president of the Ivy Dream. Welcome to another episode of Aspire, our podcast channel in which we talk with current and recent graduates of some of the most elite academic programs. Today, we are very happy to be joined by Bill Della Rosa, who is currently both a doctoral candidate at Oxford as well as a law candidate, a JD candidate at Yale Law. Bill, thank you for joining our show.
Michael, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Bill. Bill, your background is so unique that I think our audience would be very, very interested to know about your childhood, your upbringing, and we'll go into academics shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for asking, Michael. I grew up in Arizona. I was born um, in a border town known as Nogales, Arizona, but I was raised in Mexico. And part of the reason why I split my life across the border was because my mom's visa had expired. She was here on a non-immigrant visa, and when her visa expired, we decided to move to Mexico, where both my parents were from, and I spent about 7 years of my life there. Eventually, my parents decided that it would be best for their children, my brother and I, and my soon-to-be little sister, for us to grow up and in the United States and make the most of an American, public education. My mother applied for a visa to come back lawfully. She was unfortunately denied the visa, and so she made the decision, along with my father, that she was going to cross the border unlawfully. And so she came to the United States. We moved permanently. We settled in Tucson in the year 2000. And my little sister was born. My little brother was born. And we called Tucson home. And it wasn't until 2009 when my mom tried to go through the legal process and become a permanent legal resident that, she had been married to my father. My father was a U.S. citizen. And so under law, my father could petition my mom to immigrate lawfully. But we had no idea that there was a law that was written back in 1996, which basically penalized folks who were undocumented in the United States for a set period of time. And so by going through the process, you basically trigger some of those penalties automatically. And my mom went through the process in 2009 and she was penalized and she received what you call the unlawful presence bar. And so she was barred from the United States for 10 years. And so she ended up getting stuck in Mexico in 2009. And my siblings and I, as well as my father, all of us who were U.S. citizens, we stayed in Tucson. And that's basically that kind of recaps my childhood. I had a very turbulent childhood, if I'm being honest. It was full of things that we couldn't really control, and so we tried to make the most of our lives growing up. Both in low income backgrounds and deep poverty and unstable households. Given our family situation, my father, he, by comparison to my peers, was quite old. My father was born in 1932. And so, when my mom was separated from my family, I was the second oldest from my siblings. It was a matter of, looking after my siblings, becoming a surrogate parent to them, and also a caregiver for my father. And, all those little things, which I'm happy to go into detail, really defined my childhood. And I would soon find out that they would define uh, the trajectory of my life, but also my career goals and I think my purpose in what I am trying to do with the degrees that I'm pursuing at the moment.
That is quite a story there, Bill. That is also an American success story, if I may say so. It truly is are obstacles that the vast majority of people cannot truly understand and indeed to fully appreciate. I don't know if it is possible for someone who hasn't been there. Bill, with that introduction, how has it, in fact, impacted the trajectory of you academically?
Yeah, and thank you so much for your comment, Michael. I do think that my story is, in some ways, an anomaly, but it's also a reflection of what's going on, I think, in our country. And you know, it's sort of universal in many respects because I think what I'll speak to in a moment is that things like this happen in our lives and they inspire us to do something about it. And so for me, like I wasn't the best student growing up. I'll be quite honest. I'll be the first to admit that I got into a lot of trouble in school growing up. I wasn't a straight A student. I was barely passing classes. I knew school was important to me. It was important to my family. My parents, instilled in us the value of an education, but I didn't really have a purpose. But I remember it was October of 2009 when my mother was separated from my family, and when she was told that she would have to be separated from us for 10 whole years, a whole decade, it sort of, it was a moment that shook me. It was as if someone had gotten me by my shoulders and quite literally shook me because I realized in that moment that my parents had done so much for us. They had sacrificed so much along the way so that we could be raised in the United States of America, and we could receive a free public education in a society that has so much resources available for people. And I realized then that I had to do something and make the most out of my education. And so I decided to, get my priorities straight. I started focusing specifically. I had two priorities. I had, the priority to be the best in school and be a good student and make the most out of my education. And my other priority became entirely my family, looking after my siblings, making sure my little brother was 4 when my mom was separated. My little sister was 9. Making sure that they had everything they needed. My father, as I said earlier, he was old and frail, and so I was looking after him, making sure that he was eating properly, that I was looking after him, and that he had his basic needs taken care of. But I realized something along the way. Early on, I got my first semester report card. This is my sophomore year in high school, and again, I had mediocre grades my freshman year. But I realized after my first semester of sophomore year, if I recall correctly, I had gotten straight A's. And that was something that I was very proud of. But I remember taking the transcript and going to Mexico with my father and my younger siblings to spend Christmas with my mom in Nogales, Sonora. And I remember showing the transcript to my mom, and my mom sees it. And I just remember her expression and how full of hope she was. And I say this because I realized then that if I did well in school, I could give my family purpose. I could give my family hope that all of this was not in vain, that somehow it would come to an end at some point, and when it did, we would be better off. And so that put me on this path of excellence. I became not necessarily addicted to pursuing excellence in it for itself, but because it helped maintain my family spirits alive. And along the way, I became very passionate about immigrant justice and making sure that I had seen what was going on with my family, with my siblings, in the middle of nights, them struggling, myself, my father, my mom, and I realized that I didn't want any other family to go through what my family was going through. And so I became inspired at that moment in time. It would change over the course of my trajectory that I wanted to become a lawyer, that I wanted to do something about the system that we were living in and try to make it better so that other families don't go through the same hardships that my family was going through. And so I started doing well in school. I'm happy to say that I graduated valedictorian out of my high school class. It wasn't something that I devoted myself towards. It just kind of happened along the way in my pursuit to keep my family spirits alive. I'm fortunate that I had received, a Bill Gates scholarship to go to Bowdoin College in Maine, and but along the way, it was about pursuing a purpose in trying to understand what was going on around the country, how many families were facing the same circumstances, and trying to find solutions to help reform our immigration system and change people's perspectives when it comes to the topic of immigration, migration, and the realities that people are living under in our country.
Mm, that is a very commendable objective. Bill, then please take us through your academic journey since high school, and so therefore, more specifically, how your studies have manifest all these hopes that you have stated.
Certainly. And, as I mentioned before, I was getting good grades in high school after that, after my mom's separation. Uh, but, I went to a large public school where, going to college, specifically going to college out of state, was not really the norm. The majority of students in the high school that I went to are from a low income, first generation background. Uh, Many of them are, if they go to college, will be the first in their family to attend either community college or a public state university. And so I didn't really have, I would say, role models, someone that could guide me. I didn't really know the importance of, the SATs and the ACTs. And I remember that you know, for the sake of making sure that my parents' sacrifices were not in vain, at some point I decided that I wanted to go to a good college to make the most of this, of my parents' sacrifices. And I didn't do so well on the SAT, either the SAT or the ACT. And I started look. I knew that test scores really mattered for Ivy Leagues, for the best colleges in the country. And I thought that I would apply to every college I could and just maximize my chances. And I remember I went to a conference, a Questbridge conference at Stanford, uh, the summer before my senior year, and they had college admissions officers from all over the country there. And I heard for the first time of colleges like Williams and Amherst and Bates and Colby and Bowdoin. And I heard for the first time that there were colleges that were test optional. And I thought, well, maybe that could be where I could apply. I have the GPA, I have the extracurriculars, I have the leadership in the service. But if they're test optional, then maybe I really stand a good shot at getting into one of these colleges. At the same time, I was really afraid, to be honest. I mentioned earlier that my siblings, they needed someone who needed they needed someone to look after them. My father needed someone to look after him, and so I was afraid of going far away from college, far away from my home across the country. And I ended up visiting Bowdoin through a flying program in the fall, and I fell in love with the place. And I remember being on campus fall of 2011, and I remember speaking to one of the admissions officers, and I said, it was at that moment in time that I realized that I learned for the first time what ED was, early decision versus regular decision. And I remember speaking to that admissions officer, and I said, hey, so I've heard about this. Like, does that really play a difference in, boosting your probability of getting in? And then she said, yeah, you know what, Bill, like, if you're interested, like, we've already made an investment in bringing you here. But if you want to maximize your chances, like, you want to apply early decision. However, it is binding. So make sure that if you apply, you are committed to attending to this place. And so I remember flying back from Maine, Bowdoin is in Maine. And I remember thinking, like, if I this could be my ticket. This could be my ticket into getting to a really good school, right? Do I want to chance it with Harvard and Stanford and Yale? I could really see myself at Bowdoin. They have a renowned government and legal studies program. I loved the feel of the college, how small it was. I loved the community aspect. I loved the college's devotion to the common good. And I remember thinking that flight home, weighing the pros and cons to my family and the college. And when I touched ground, in Tucson, I remember speaking to my mom over the phone and asking her, like, what do you think, Mom? Like, I stand a really good chance at getting in if I apply early, but if I get in, I am committed. And one of the first things she said, go, go, like, we're going to be fine. You have to do this for yourself. And by going there, you will be more prepared to affect change, not just for us, but for the wider world, people who are in the same shoes that we're in. And so you do that. Go do that. We're gonna do fine. We'll make it work. And long story short, Michael, I applied early, and I remember December. It was right before my birthday. I received my college admissions acceptance from Bowdoin, and I received a full financial aid offer from them. And I remember that day as if it was yesterday. And I remember how special that was, not just for me, but for my family, and what that meant for them. And I knew then that getting accepted and receiving that full financial aid offer had changed not just my family, but generations that would come after me. And so that set me off on a different path. And I'm happy, more than happy to talk about my time at Bowdoin because that was really, 4 formative years of my life.
Yes, we would like to hear all about that, Bill. Indeed. Please tell us about how it became formative into your life and how it prepared you for all the many things that have come subsequently.
Yeah, so I alluded to it earlier. They had a renowned government and legal studies program, and that's what I thought I was going to major in. I thought at that point in time that I would go there, major in government and legal studies, that I would eventually apply to law school and go to law school, become a lawyer, and fight for immigrant rights. And I remember I couldn't get in Introduction to American Government my first semester. And so I had a class that I needed to fill somehow. My pre-major advisor, Crystal Van Vliet, she suggested that I take one of her colleagues' class, Introduction to Sociology, taught by Nancy Riley. And, I was a bit hesitant, sociology, what is that? And long story short, I ended up taking the class. And I remember just being so amazed by what I was learning, getting a vocabulary for the things that I had been wrestling with internally, questions of class, questions of race and gender, questions of sexuality, and finding out that there was a whole set of research and ideas behind each of these ideas, trying to understand the relationship between individuals, we as individuals, and our role within institutions, and the role that we all play within society and how we influence one another. And I also remember that Professor Riley, I had approached her one evening. I said, Professor Riley, I didn't do so well in my first exam. Can I do something to make up and get some extra credit? And she said, well, Bill, there's this lecturer. There's an anthropologist coming from the University of Michigan. His name is Jason De Leon. And if you go to his lecture and you write me a report, I'll give you some extra credit. And so I said, sure, why not? So I ended up going to this lecture. And I just remember being profoundly affected and moved by his research. He ran a project called the Undocumented Migration Project. It's a long-term anthropological study that takes place in Arizona. And I just remember being impacted by it because I grew up in Arizona and I had no idea that what he was talking about was basically happening in my backyard. And so his study looked into the objects that people left behind when they crossed the border unlawfully. And he tried to humanize the process by understanding, what does this say about the process, about people's journey? The fact that they're carrying pictures of their loved ones, water bottles, backpacks, rosaries, Bibles, and really analyzes within an anthropological context. And I remember I approached him right after the lecture. And I said, Professor De Leon, my name is Bill. I'm from Tucson. I would love to get involved. And Fast forward, next thing you know, that following summer, I'm camping with him and others in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, waking up at 4 in the morning, hiking the mountains and looking for things that people left behind and trying to understand this process. And that put me on a whole different path. It put me on a research path, on an academic path. I became really interested in like people's stories, understanding their lived experiences, what motivated them, why were they risking their lives, why did they flee their homes, and why they were coming to the United States, this country of profound promise. What was drawing them? And I became really invested in pursuing these research questions, which then put me on a path towards independent study, research, uh, which will like it would ultimately lead me to pursue my master's degrees as well as my PhD.
Yes, let's go right into it right now, actually. Please tell our audience how it did and where you went for your master's degrees.
Certainly. Well, while I was going through this process, I will say, to be quite honest, that I became really frustrated with the legal system that we had because one, nothing was being done at the at the legal systems level, and immigration attorneys were really working within a system which tied their hands, and so they couldn't really help families like my own because of how the laws were written. And so I thought research would be the way that I would spend my life trying to understand people's experiences and trying to design policies that better reflected the realities of our society. And so I thought at that moment in time that I probably wasn't going to pursue law school. And I remember gathering an array of different experiences. I worked in nonprofits. I worked for legal aid organizations. I did more research, and I thought I learned about these programs offered in the United Kingdom in migration, and I thought, you know what, I've been studying this issue from an American lens for a really long time. Maybe I can learn something about how the European Union understands this question. At the time, there was a refugee crisis happening from Syria and other countries along North Africa, and maybe I thought theoretically I could get a better understanding, go there, come back, and apply that those theoretical concepts here. And so I started looking into abroad programs and to pursue a master's degree. I thought I was going to pursue a PhD right there and then. I didn't end up doing that. But I remember applying my senior year of Bowdoin to a Marshall scholarship. I did not apply to the Rhodes Scholarship my senior year. I mention this now because I eventually did apply for the Rhodes Scholarship, but I applied for the Marshall Scholarship my senior year of Bowdoin. And I remember I got an interview, I made it to the final round, and I did not get it, right? I did not get the Marshall Scholarship. At the same time, I had applied for another scholarship that is very regional. I don't think the audience might be familiar with, but the scholarship is called the Casey Scholarship. It's a scholarship that only students from Harvard, Princeton, Bowdoin, Williams, and a very select few New England colleges can nominate students for. And it's to study in the United Kingdom, and specifically Cambridge, Oxford, and Edinburgh, I believe, and maybe St. Andrews. And I mention the scholarship because the scholarship, in addition to applying for to the scholarship through the foundation, it asks you to submit an application to your graduate program that you intend to study for, because they want to make sure that you can at least get it before they award you the scholarship. And so I also submitted, along with my Marshall scholarship application, along with the Casey scholarship application, I applied directly to study at Oxford. And so I didn't get the Casey in the end, and I did not get the Marshall in the end. But come March or April of 2016, I got an acceptance to the University of Oxford, but I did not have the funding, and that was a problem. And so I ended up taking a job in Washington, D.C. I deferred my admission to Oxford. I took a job in Washington, D.C. to work for the federal government, specifically within the Department of Health and Human Services. I had received a Truman Scholarship, and so that placed me within a Truman. They call it the Truman Albright Fellowship, and I got placed in DC within this agency. And I thought, during that year, I will apply to every scholarship available. So I applied to the UK Fulbright. I applied again to the Marshall. I applied again, for the first time, to the Rhodes, and um, something that would get me the funding to go to Oxford, right? And um, long story short, I went through every one of these processes. I made it to the final round of the Rhodes. I made it to the final round of the Marshall. I made it to the final round of the Fulbright, and I got the Marshall. I got a Marshall scholarship. I withdrew my application from the Fulbright because the Marshall basically covered my expenses for. At the time, I had applied for a 1-year master's through the Marshall, as well as the PhD, or what you call the DPhil at Oxford. And so they were providing me the funding to study at Oxford for 4 years. And I thought I was set. That was it. And so, I went to Oxford, and I spent, for details I could get into, but I spent 2 years on a Marshall. I opted out for 2 master's degrees, one in migration studies, and the second master's in criminology and criminal justice. And then I took some time off to work. And only after that, I returned to Oxford on what you call the Clarendon Scholarship to study for a PhD.
Congratulations on all those tremendous successes. It truly is extraordinary. I personally have never met someone who has achieved what you just have described. Um, Academically, Bill, did Oxford provide you with the training, the academic training that you sought?
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. And I will say that I think partly yes and partly no. And let me explain what I mean by that. Um, my first master's degree, it was I I don't think I learned as much as I thought I was going to learn academically, only because since freshman year through my senior year at Bowdoin, I spent those 4 years studying migration, and I realized that much of the information that we were covering throughout my 1 year master's course at Oxford was essentially covering roughly the same material that I was used to, and so academically, not so much. And I wasn't really disappointed because I realized that while I was there, that the true value of the educational experience was who I was getting to meet. Not just outside the classroom, but even my peers, right? My peers, what made the program exceptional was the fact that it was very international. And so you had folks from all across Europe, from Asia, from Latin America, from the United States. And that was fascinating because I was learning about their research, their passions, what drove them, what was working in their countries, what was not working, and that provided an educational component that I think made up for what I was lacking from my texts, and my readings. Now, I will also say that it's because of that experience that I had educationally that I thought, you know what, I don't want to do my PhD here at Oxford, and so that's when I made the decision to opt out instead for another 1 year master's course in criminal justice. And I will say that for that second master's degree, I got I got what I was lacking from the first. And I think that's partly because, I wasn't used to studying criminal justice, and everything was new. The learning curve was pretty steep. I was learning everything. The workload was pretty intense. And I also got the component of learning from people from different backgrounds. And so that was exceptional. And by then, however, I had already used up my Marshall scholarship. And I also, I was going through a lot personally during those 2 years. My father had passed away, and yeah, so I was just going through a lot, and I was taking on so much. One those master's degrees, I shouldn't even call them 1 year master's degrees because they're 9 month long, and so they are really intense. And I did two of them back to back. I remember I was studying for the LSAT, and I was just taking on so much that I felt at that very moment that I was drowning in the work that I was doing. and I decided right there and then that I needed to take time off. And so after my second master's, I packed my bags and I returned to Arizona to be with my family and to get some more professional experience before figuring out what came next.
What may I ask, what did you do professionally in that time?
Yeah, so I ended up joining. I ended up working for my local government, Pima County, and I joined the Pima County Administrator's Office, and I worked specifically for the Criminal Justice Reform Unit, and I was in charge of research and writing, and specifically addressing the racial disparities within the county jail and across the justice system. This was the year that George Floyd was murdered. And so there was a real racial reckoning happening across the country. And I was in charge of leading local police reform efforts, trying to figure out how we can make, law enforcement not just accountable to the public, but making it more diverse, making sure that, people felt safe, addressing the racial disparities across the system, but making sure that at the same time that people felt safe. And and I was responsible for working across different agencies, and that was an experience that actually I was able to use the my master's degree, the knowledge that I gained, the theory that I gained from Oxford directly and put it into practice, which I found profoundly refreshing. And it was also an experience that helped me decide that, come back, get back on the horse and decide that, what, I could see myself going to law school and doing this again for a number of reasons. But I decided that right there and then that I would also apply for a PhD just to see if I got accepted, just to see if I had how many options I had available, and really make an informed decision with regards to what my next steps would be and how I could best affect social change.
That's great. That's absolutely wonderful. Bill, not many people would know about this joint program, the doctorate at Oxford and the JD at Yale Law. Could you tell us about that and the application process for each?
Yeah, and I'll be very honest with you, Michael. The program really came together as a matter of accident, not because it was deliberate or intentional. I come November of 2019, I think I put in PhD applications, I put in law school applications, and I ended up getting accepted to. Well, I got into Yale. I got into as far as on the law school front, my final two decisions were between um, uh, an acceptance at Yale Law School and a full ride scholarship, the Root Tilden Curran Scholarship at NYU. And for me, I that was really tough because I come from a low income background. Taking on massive amounts of debt was a big thing to do, and so I was really leaning towards NYU. Um, and NYU gave me around 72 hours to decide whether I wanted to take the scholarship or not. And and literally within that time frame, um, I should also say that I knew that I had gotten my PhD offer at the Faculty of Law at Oxford. Um, but within that time span, within those 72 hours, I got an email from Oxford saying that I had been selected for their prestigious Clarendon Scholarship, and that would cover my entire PhD, living expenses, room and board, tuition fees, everything. And I thought, oh my goodness, what? Like, I never imagined having these options available. And so I decided right then and then that I would do the PhD. So I went to both Yale and NYU and I said, excuse me, like, this option has been presented. May I defer my admission to your schools? Yale, right off the bat, said, yeah, we will give you a 3-year deferral. NYU said, we'll give you the deferral. However, you need to forfeit the scholarship. When I heard that, the option was pretty clear. And so I deferred Yale and I went to Oxford. I went to Oxford to do my PhD, while I was there, this is the middle of the pandemic, and most of my research involved qualitative work, operating out of shelters in Mexico with populations that don't really have access to decent healthcare, and so the school put basically a halt, a freeze on any human, quote unquote, human subject related research. That pushed my research, and that delayed my research and my research plans. And so, what I should have finished the PhD before I joined law school eventually, I did not, and so I brought the PhD with me to law school, and so it it became by accident a joint program. I am currently ABD, anything but my dissertation. I'm currently I'm hoping I can finish it by the following summer. But I'm simultaneously doing law school, and so that's really how it happened. I will say that Yale is really open to having joint programs, either a joint JD MPP or a joint JD MPA. And there are many folks who are doing a joint JD PhD, and that's an application process that once you get a Yale, I mean, you could apply for it before you even apply, or while you're applying to Yale, or you can apply for the joint status once you're already a student at Yale. And the process is pretty straightforward. And I think you really make the most of the time because you're able to, cut some corners and finish both degrees to spare, maybe about a year or two.
That is really wonderful and very interesting to know about Yale. Bill, let's talk about your application process to Yale. There is the famous 250 word maximum essay for applicants. Bill, how did you approach such a compressed statement?
I'm so glad you asked this, Michael, because I remember I always talk about my 250 because I found it so. It is a difficult prompt, I will say. It is an exceptionally difficult prompt because it's open ended. Write about whatever you want, but do so in 250 words. And I I thought, I want to write something that no one's going to write about, something that's unique. Um, and I said, you know what? I'm going to write about DJing. And while I was at Oxford, I became spontaneously a DJ, and so I was DJing at different colleges, and it's a hobby that I loved very much, but it's also a hobby that taught me so much, and it taught me so much about leadership. And so my 250 essay response became about that, right? The relationship between leadership and DJing, and to give you a quick example, when you're a DJ, um, and specifically when you're DJing for, let's say, events or parties where people have paid a cover to attend, you're essentially responsible for their entertainment, and so you want to make sure that everyone's being entertained, and it just so happens that to entertain the vast majority of folks, you're playing basically all popular hits. Um, but Oxford is a very diverse place. The student body is exceptionally diverse. You have people from all corners of the world attending this incredible institution, and you'd have people who would come up to me from, let's say, as an example, Pakistan, and they would say, "Hey, can you play the song?" So I'd play the song, and I would see the reaction of the crowd. I'm basically killing the vibe, and that was it was a tug of war. It was a tension for me personally because I'm responsible for people's entertainment. I'm responsible for um, the mass number of people, but I also want to make sure that people feel included, that people feel heard, that people have a place that they feel like they belong to at Oxford. And so I made a decision, and my philosophy, my approach to DJing was I would give people who wanted me to play their songs from their specific regions, whether it be India or Pakistan or other places, minutes. I would give them time for them to hear their music, and then eventually revert back to the popular hits, and that was about inclusivity. It taught me the importance of making sure that people felt included. And so my essay really grappled with these themes.
That is quite a bit to say in 250 words, Bill. I commend you for doing so. Bill, with all the academics you were engaged in at the time, how did you find the time to study for the LSAT?
Right. Yeah. So I had previously mentioned that I was studying for the LSAT when I was at Oxford, in between my master's degrees. And it was right around that time while I was studying for the LSAT that I got a call from my mom, and I was in England at the moment, and she said mijo, which is my son in Spanish. She says, your father has had another stroke, and doctors have given him just a few weeks to live, and so I think it's time for you to come home and hopefully I can come visit him and say my last goodbyes. And so I put the LSAT away, and I put everything else away, and I only focused on my family, and trying to get my mom a temporary pass to come back to the country so that she could say her last goodbyes. And after that, my father eventually died, and we had a funeral. I needed time to. We all needed time to grieve and process what had happened, um, and I felt a little lost. I wasn't sure if I was gonna go to law school. I went back to England to finish my second degree, um, and I realized then that I needed time away from school for a bit. So that's when I went back to Arizona. And lo and behold, while going through this process, I eventually got back on the LSAT. But I made a mistake, Michael. I made a mistake, and it's a mistake that I honestly felt quite amateur. I had not registered for the LSAT test date in time, and with law school admissions, Michael, it really matters to apply. I will say, with the exception of Yale and Stanford, to apply as early as possible to maximize your admissions probability, because law school has rolling admissions, and so because I missed the day that I had to register the test by, it meant that by the time I did register for the next test, I would be taking the test sometime in December, I believe. And so by the time I got my scores back, it'd be maybe mid January, and then by then it's just really late. And so I felt I felt quite silly, honestly, and I felt like I had really ruined my chances that I would have to wait another year. Um, at the same time, right around when I was juggling, all these thoughts, Yale had announced that they were becoming LSAT optional, and so by that point, Harvard, Yale, almost every school had become LSAT optional except Stanford and I think Berkeley. I thought about applying for the Knight Hennessy at Stanford, but because so I made a decision that I was going to take the GRE instead. Um, and so I knew that would foreclose my chances at applying for Stanford and the Knight Hennessy and Berkeley. But I found out that the GRE is a test that you can register for the very next day if there's room at the specific testing centers nearby. And so I gave myself 2 weeks, and I said, you know what, I will just cram math everything I could in these 2 weeks, and I'm just gonna take this test, and I will apply, as early as possible, and I did that. So I avoided the LSAT, thankfully, but I ended up taking the GRE, and I went with the score that I got. I obviously I don't recommend this to anyone, and which is to say that with appropriate and responsible time management, I I would have saved myself a lot of stress. I hope others can also save themselves a lot of stress. The test scores are also, they're obviously really important. I don't think they're the most important thing in an application personally, but I took the GRE, I cramped for it in 2 weeks, and yeah, I went with that, and thankfully it all worked out for me.
Yes, that is quite a time frame. Was that the similar time frame for you to obtain your necessary letters of recommendation? Was that just a 2-week process as well?
Luckily, I had already been working on my personal statements, my essays, all my letters. So I had all of that basically lined up and ready. So fortunately, and we're always looking for the silver linings. I only had the test to worry about, so I was able to devote every second that I had for those 2 weeks towards learning what the GRE was and how to best prepare for it. And and also, thankfully for me, because I have a history of applying to different programs, different scholarships, my letter recommenders, they basically already had letters for me, and so every time I asked them for another letter, they're by that point they're only tweaking what they had already written, which is obviously really helpful. And and so long story short, I had everything that I needed, except for that test score.
Were interviews necessary that year?
Interviews were not necessary at that point in time. I did interview for the Root Tilden Current Scholarship. That is an interview process, but except for Harvard, no school at that point in time, I think, required interviews.
Yes, that did certainly must have saved some time. Now, Bill, um, you're at Yale Law. You're still completing your doctorate. How are you juggling that?
That's a great question that I ask myself every single day. Um, um, I think right now I I was really this is my second year of studying law, and so last year was really difficult because I was really trying to juggle both at the same time, and that was a really bad idea. And it wasn't until just this last summer, just a few weeks ago, I had a meeting with my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, and then she said, "Bill, could I ask you something?" And I said, "Yeah, what's that, Mary?" And she said, "What's the rush?" And I said, "What do you mean? Like, the PhD will get done. Like, what? Focus on what you're doing now. Like, don't stress yourself out. You will finish the PhD eventually. So what's the rush?" And I had already thought about that, but I think being asked explicitly by my own supervisor really made me think. You know what? I don't need to really worry about my PhD at the moment. I have breaks for that. For now, it's best for me to concentrate in my legal education, which is already stressful as it is, and really, we're focused on the PhD, finish it by the following summer, and so um, that's helped me so much this year. I will say, because last year it really wasn't working out.
Oh, it really wasn't. Well, and now, Bill, what have you decided that you will return to your dissertation after law school?
Yeah, I'm gonna return to it. I think during winter break, and then again over the spring break, and then finally over the summer. I'm nearly done, so I should say I am nearly done. I am more than halfway done. I have about two to three chapters that I have to complete. So it's not, all this to say is that it's almost done. I will finish it. I will actually finish my PhD before I finish my JD. So I've done all my research already. Right now, I'm just in the writing phase, which eventually will happen when I am not in a classroom.
Mm, that's quite an academic load you've built upon yourself, and of course, I wish you the very best. Bill, we've come somewhat to this topic, but let's project ahead some years. You're a JD PhD by then, with a ton of degrees behind you. What do you see specifically doing at that time?
Yeah. So as soon as I finish my legal education, the plan is to move straight back to Arizona, and I will be going back to Tucson, where I'm from, and really trying to make a difference. Um, on a personal level, I feel like I have a lot of catching up. So this is something that I haven't said, but my mom was finally able to return to the United States back in January.
Oh,
Yeah,
of this year?
of this year, and so
Congratulations, Bill. Congratulations to your family.
thank you so much, Michael. I really, really appreciate that. It took her 14 years and 99 days to come back, but she's back. Obviously, circumstances have changed tremendously, But I feel like on a personal level, I need to spend more time with her and help her become reintegrated back into American society. And on a more structural level, there's work that needs to be done, Michael. Back in Tucson, there's work that has to be done politically, that has to be done legally, socially, helping to make a difference. And so I envision myself going straight to Arizona as soon as I'm done. And I am open for what's next. I want to practice law for a little bit. I'd love to teach at the law school there, the James E. Rogers School of Law at the University of Arizona. I would love to get involved with policy as well, and potentially run for office one day. And so wherever I could make a difference and help bend, the moral arc of the universe towards justice, even if it's just a little bit, that's what I want to do. But my plan right now is Arizona.
Hmm. And that's quite a plan, quite an admirable plan indeed. Bill, I'd just like to say that yours is truly already a tremendous success story, one of tremendous inspiration, I hope, to so many of our audience listening. And as I said, you've achieved so much in your time already. I already know that your professional goals will be not only achieved, but super achieved uh, beyond current expectations, Bill. Quite a story indeed. To our audience, we have just been talking with Bill De La Rosa. There is no way for me to summarize anything that all that he has just informed us of, but we encourage you to please share with your friends this podcast. Let them know what is possible with diligent study, relentless commitment to a cause, and please let Bill be your inspiration.
Michael, I am thankful for you. Thank you for putting this together. I am grateful for the opportunity to share my story and to inspire others to be their best. I am honored and humbled. Thank you so much.
Bill, we here at the Ivy Dream wish you the very, very best. I encourage you, I invite you, please stay in contact with us. Let us know how you're doing. Perhaps as you feel fit, please come back on our show. Share with us your update and your progress towards anything else you're doing.
Thank you so much. I will do.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to our audience.